The talk show host was mocking Keanu Reeves' past. The audience was laughing. Keanu just listened. But then, the host's voice began to shake. By the way, before we continue, if you want to see more Keanu Reeves stories, don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's get back to the story. Piers Morgan's show began with its usual tension in the air. As the cameras rolled, sharp lights lit the studio. The audience was ready. The crew wore their typical seriousness. But that day, something was different. Everyone was a bit more alert, because Keanu Reeves was about to sit in the guest chair. John Wick, The Matrix. But more than that, he was known for something else. His silence, his kindness, the way he stayed out of the spotlight. Piers didn't particularly like people like that. To him, the show wasn't about discovering the guest. It was about breaking them. And Keanu's too clean reputation? To him, that felt fake. "We've got a huge star with us today," Piers said with a smile. "He's so humble, he refuses to even act cool." Can you believe that? The audience chuckled lightly. Keanu had walked in wearing a plain black t-shirt and a blazer. No visible brands. Hair down to his shoulders. Eyes tired, but calm. Piers didn't waste time. "They call you the most mysterious man in Hollywood. But I'm here, Keanu. I'm going to ask. And I want to know who you really are." Keanu smiled. "Go ahead," he said quietly. But Piers had already prepared his first strike. "You were abandoned as a child, weren't you?" he said, mockingly. "Every superhero has a tragic backstory. How real is yours?" A low murmur rippled through the room. Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply lowered his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "My mother and I moved to Canada. It was hard." Piers jumped on it. "Sorry, but it sounds a little too scripted. You overcame everything. You're silent, mysterious. Isn't that a bit performative? A bit calculated?" Keanu lifted his head just a little. "No," he said. "I just prefer not to speak." There was scattered laughter from the audience. But Piers pushed further. No one stays at the top in Hollywood by staying silent. "So what else did you do, Keanu? Do you really think your talent alone got you here?" This time, the room went quiet. Keanu waited a moment. He didn't seem to be thinking. It was like he already knew the answer. "Sometimes you lose things," he said. "And all that's left is silence." Piers was clearly unsettled by the answer. He liked controlling the dialogue. But this man could disarm him with a single sentence. Still, he pushed on. He held up an old photo of Keanu. This was taken in 1988. Back then, people said you were spiraling out of control. Was it really that bad? The tension thickened. The audience went quiet. Keanu looked at the photo. He smiled, but it was a painful kind of smile. "If anyone was hurt in my past, even then, I was already hurting myself," he said. And at that moment, Piers's voice trembled. He couldn't move on to the next question. He looked at his notes but didn't say a word. The studio fell completely silent. It was like everyone realized something had shifted, but no one could name what it was. Keanu Reeves was still calm, still waiting. Maybe for the first time, it wasn't the person in front of him speaking. It was the silence within him. There was a strange silence in the studio. No applause came, no laughter. Keanu's sentence lingered in the air. "If someone was hurt in my past, even back then, I was already hurting myself." Piers Morgan looked down at his notes. But the pages suddenly felt meaningless. None of the lines he had prepared could find a place inside that silence. After a moment, he tried to pull himself together. He forced a smile. But that smile wasn't for the audience anymore. It was just to convince himself. "So, you're saying regret," he said with effort. "But what exactly are you regretting? Your career always moved upward. It couldn't have been that bad, right?" Keanu Reeves raised his head. "Some people never forget success," he said. Others only remember their failures. I'm one of the latter. Piers slowly placed the pen he was holding onto the table. If someone like you still feels like a failure, then what are the rest of us supposed to do? He asked without meaning to. The audience was surprised. That question wasn't rehearsed. And for the first time, Piers wasn't speaking through his usual mask. Keanu's reply was short. They don't have to stay silent, but they need to know why they're speaking. This time, Piers laughed, but it was a nervous kind of laugh. Are you always like this? The guy who flips everything around. Answers like John Wick. Staying silent, knowing why you speak. Seriously, does that really do it for you? Keanu Reeves just looked at him. He didn't smile, didn't defend himself. It was like he wanted to say, it would be enough for you too, but didn't say it. Whispers started among the audience. Everyone had noticed that Piers was off balance. The man who once controlled the entire studio was now fidgeting at his own desk. One of the tech crew whispered from the control room, "Watch the time, pacing is slowing." But everyone in that room knew the truth. It wasn't the pacing that had dropped. It was Piers. The host reached into his bag and pulled out an old newspaper clipping. A short quote from a 90s interview with Keanu. He held the page out toward him. "You said something here," he began. "People look at me like I'm a hero. But when I look in the mirror each morning, I just see silence." Did you really say that? Keanu Reeves paused for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "Because at the time, the only place I could hear my voice was inside." Piers froze completely this time. That sentence felt like it had come from inside himself. He looked away for a moment, swallowed hard, and asked, "Why did you say that? You were at the height of your fame." Keanu leaned back in his seat. "Because the quietest place at the top is inside. Outside, everyone is shouting. But inside, no one speaks." Piers Morgan closed his eyes. Another silence followed. This one was heavier. It wasn't just a pause. It was the beginning of a crack. Piers Morgan was still holding the clipping in his hand, but now his fingers were trembling. The page no longer felt like a simple piece of paper, but like a memory he had buried long ago, suddenly too heavy to hold. "When you gave that interview," he said in a muffled voice, "I was just starting my career. I had a new show. No one was watching. There was an odd silence in the studio." For the first time, Piers had begun talking about himself. Unfiltered, unprepared. "One night, we were supposed to host a major guest on live TV," he said. "Everything was going perfectly. Everything was under control, until one sentence changed everything." The audience said nothing now. Keanu Reeves was still listening. There was no pity or superiority in his eyes, just presence, like a real listener. Piers continued. "That night, the guest said something harsh to me, on live television. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But something broke inside me. Nobody noticed, but from that day on, I became someone else." Keanu never looked away. He didn't ask questions. He didn't react. It was perhaps the first moment that unfolded outside Piers's control. The man who had opened others up for years was now revealing his own truth, and all that stood beside him was silence. But that silence wasn't empty. It was reflective. Piers took a deep breath. "I'd first read your interview that same day," he said. "When I look in the mirror, I see silence. And the only thing I thought was, so this man feels alone too." Keanu Reeves's expression shifted for the first time. His eyes glistened, but it wasn't sadness. It was something like being understood. Piers leaned back in his chair. "All these years, I never understood you," he said. "I thought someone who stays quiet must be weak. I assumed that just because you didn't say it, you hadn't lived it." Keanu leaned forward slightly. His voice remained calm, almost a whisper. "Some people feel better when they show their pain," he said. "But others, survive by carrying it. One audience member sniffled quietly. A woman beside him wiped away a tear, but no one spoke. Piers Morgan loosened his tie with one hand. It wasn't a sign of weakness, but the surrender of a defense. "I came here not to host you, but to fix you," he said, "and I was wrong." Keanu Reeves didn't respond, but he looked at Piers without blinking. That gaze said more than any answer could. The audience was still seated, but their focus had shifted. It was as if they were no longer watching a show, but witnessing a man slowly confronting his truth. Even the cameraman had started filming with a shaky hand. His eyes weren't on the viewfinder anymore. They were on the stage. The control room may have considered cutting to a commercial, but no one dared to press the button. Piers lowered his head. He clasped his hands together. He remained silent for a moment. Then he whispered a single sentence. "Maybe I've never really hurt myself." And at that moment, even Keanu Reeves lowered his head, because for the first time, someone wasn't just hearing him. They were starting to hear themselves. Piers Morgan had lowered his head. The studio lights were still on, but no one was pretending to watch a show anymore. The production crew could still hear voices in their earpieces, but no one dared to give commands. Only a single light remained. One man stayed silent, and the other slowly came undone. Keanu Reeves didn't speak in that moment, but his gaze held steady. It wasn't harsh, and it wasn't comforting. It just carried a kind of clarity that quietly stirred something inside you. Piers slowly raised his head. "I've written dozens of headlines about you," he said. "The silent star, the distant man, unreal humility. But I never actually looked at you. I just wrote. And what seemed written about you was actually always about me." The faces in the audience were solemn. The cameras were no longer capturing a scene, but bearing witness to something real. "You know," said Piers, "when I was little, I kept a notebook in my room. Whenever I couldn't speak up, I'd write a sentence in it. When my parents fought, when someone smiled at me at school, or when someone ignored me." He let out a sound like a laugh, but his voice cracked. "Then I became a journalist. And that notebook, in a way, turned into something for everyone. But inside, I stayed quiet. And I tried to drown that silence with the noise of others." Keanu tilted his head slightly. It was as if even he wanted to speak now, but he didn't need to. Piers's eyes were filled with tears. He didn't wipe them. He didn't hide. That moment had laid him bare completely. "I don't cry on air," he said, forcing a smile. "At least I didn't used to." Keanu Reeves leaned forward then, slightly, and finally he spoke a single sentence. His voice was neither loud nor shaky, just clear and still. "Sometimes it's not crying that breaks you. It's hearing something for the first time." Something cracked in the studio at that moment. Not even applause came, because no one felt brave enough to interrupt that silence. Piers lowered his head again. His shoulders trembled. He slowly leaned back in his chair. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a surrender to silence, to himself, and maybe, for the first time, to someone else. The studio was wrapped in silence, but it wasn't cold. It was full, warm, and heavy, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. Piers Morgan leaned slightly forward in his chair. He didn't wipe his eyes. The tears were now part of the broadcast. For a moment, he said nothing. He moved his notes aside. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't even face Keanu Reeves directly. But something sat in the air between them, undeniable, unnamed. Finally, Piers spoke. "Sometimes on this show, I ask questions," he said. "Not to get answers, but to assert control." He paused. "But today, for the first time, an answer freed me from control." Keanu gave a slight nod. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was quiet, genuine, and impossible to ignore. Piers continued speaking slowly, as if realizing each word just before saying it. "I thought I invited you here, Keanu. but maybe I was your guest all along. And you were never the host, because you stayed silent. And we started listening. In the audience, some eyes were wet, but not from staged emotion. It was that strange, piercing moment when someone else voices the silence you've carried. The cameraman slowly zoomed in on Keanu's face. He was calm. His gaze carried weight, but it didn't demand anything. It just existed. Present, unflinching, steady in a space where most falter. Suddenly, Piers tried to compose himself. "I suppose it's time to wrap up the show," he said, but the words didn't land as they used to. His voice trembled. It wasn't just fatigue. It was honesty slipping out for the first time. He turned toward Keanu. "Do you want to say anything before we close?" Keanu smiled. It was the first true smile of the entire interview. He tilted his head, reached into his blazer pocket, and pulled out a crumpled note. He looked at it for a moment and then said, "Everyone wants to find their voice. But some people, when they stay silent, say far more." The studio froze. Piers Morgan lowered his head. The only words he could whisper were, "Thank you." But that thank you wasn't for a celebrity. It was for a mirror, for a buried memory, for someone truly heard. Keanu stood. The audience looked at him, but no one clapped. This wasn't an ending. It was recognition. As he walked out, he didn't look back. He didn't wave. He didn't say goodbye to the camera. But something left the studio with him, a silence that had pierced the noise. And that silence, it didn't vanish. It settled quietly in the hearts of those watching. Because this time, the story didn't end with Keanu Reeves. It continued in everyone who suddenly found the courage to listen, not just to others, but to the voice they'd long ignored inside. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more like it. We'll meet again somewhere in the next silence.